The first thing I want to ask you is not how much money you make. It is not what stock you own. It is not whether you think the market is expensive. It is simpler than that. When was the last time you looked at your bank account and felt proud, not relieved, not less afraid than yesterday proud? Proud because what you saw reflected intention. Proud because it looked like you'd been living on purpose instead of drifting on appetite. Proud because the numbers on the screen suggested that your future self might actually one day look back and thank you. For most people, that moment is rare. That is not because they are lazy. It is not because they are incapable. It is because almost nobody teaches them what money is actually supposed to do. They are taught how to earn. They are taught how to spend. They are taught how to compare. They are taught how to signal success before they have built it. But they are almost never taught early enough the simple rules that let small amounts become large ones without drama. That is what I want to talk about. Not fantasy, not one miraculous stock. Not some promise that if you click fast enough and believe hard enough, the laws of compounding will start behaving like a casino. I have no interest in that kind of talk. I am interested in the kind of truth that sounds almost too plain at first. The truth that money is not built in bursts. It is built in habits, in gaps, in systems, in quiet refusals. In long stretches where nothing looks dramatic and yet everything important is happening underneath. If you want the mother line for everything I am about to say, here it is. Turning small sums into serious wealth is not mainly an investing trick. It is the result of building a life where the gap between what comes in and what goes out is protected, invested. And left alone long enough, that time starts doing work your labor alone never could. That is the line, read it again. Because once you understand that, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking what secret the rich know. You stop asking what hot stock could rescue a weak structure. You stop asking what shortcut might save you from the mathematics of ordinary life. You start asking the only question that matters: what kind of person and what kind of system keeps enough money alive long enough for compounding to become visible? That is the real question. Most people never ask it. They think the problem is income. Sometimes it is. More often the deeper problem is that every increase in income gets greeted by a matching increase in appetite. A raise arrives and the car changes, a bonus arrives and the vacation improves. A better year comes in and somehow the checking account still looks confused 3 months later. That is not because the person is evil. It is because lifestyle inflation is one of the most seductive forces in American life, and it wears the mask of reward. You worked hard, you deserve something, fine. That sentence has ruined a lot of households, not because enjoyment is wrong, because automatic enjoyment expands until it consumes the exact gap that was supposed to become the future. That gap is everything. If I earn $5,000 and spend $5,000, I have activity. If I earn $5,000 and build my life around $4,000, I have a machine beginning. That difference looks small from the outside. It is enormous over time. This is why I say wealth is not built first by what you make. It is built first by what you refuse to let disappear. That is the first rule: spend less than you earn. Always, I do not mean live like a monk. I do not mean decorate suffering and call it virtue. I mean maintain a real intentional gap between income and lifestyle so that the future has fuel. That gap is leverage. That gap is breathing room. That gap is your first piece of private power. And what most people do is erase it as fast as they create it. They close the gap because culturally we have been taught that visible reward is the point of work. I do not believe that. I think the visible reward is often the bait. The real reward is the claim you quietly build by not spending every improvement as soon as it appears. That is one reason so many decent earners stay financially fragile. They do not lack income. They lack preserved surplus. Without surplus, nothing compounds. Without surplus, every dream still requires your body tomorrow morning. Without surplus, every bad event remains a threat. A person with a good salary and no preserved gap is not rich. He is well paid and exposed. That is a very different thing. Now, once that gap exists, a second rule becomes obvious. Start now, not later. Not when you feel more educated. Not when the market finally feels comfortable. Not when the election passes. Not when rates move. Not when your life becomes calm. That day never arrives. The source material uses the simple comparison between someone who starts investing at 25 and someone who waits until 35. The result is not a little different. It is violently different, even with the same monthly amount and the same return assumptions. Faithful site, Fay turn 44 file 0 Fay, that difference is not magic. It is simply time receiving capital sooner. And time is much more powerful than most people emotionally understand. They understand it intellectually. They can repeat the phrase compound interest and nod as if they respect it. Then they delay for 3 more years. That is because compounding is easy to understand and emotionally hard to honor. Why? Because the first stage is insulting. You put in $500 a month, the account moves, but not enough to feel cinematic. You save for a year. It matters, but not enough to flatter your ego. That is the problem. The early phase of compounding looks small precisely when your sacrifice still feels large. That is why people wait. They keep telling themselves they will start when they have more. But the whole point of starting early is that you do not need more in order for time to begin. That is what the waiting person keeps forfeiting, not money alone, years. And years are worth much more than people think. The tree grows because of seasons, not because of one afternoon of enthusiasm. Money grows the same way. So the second rule is this: start now with what you have. Whatever you have, a small monthly amount begun today is often worth more than a larger monthly amount delayed until you feel ready. Readiness is mostly a story fear tells to sound prudent. The market does not pay you for readiness. It pays you for time in the structure. Now let me say something harder. Starting is not just a financial act, it is a psychological act. The day you begin, even with a small amount, you stop being a spectator of wealth and become a participant in its mechanism that matters, because identity changes behavior. A person who sees himself as an investor behaves differently from a person who sees investing as something he will one day do. A person who has money moving automatically into claims on the future begins thinking differently about spending in the present, not perfectly differently. That difference compounds too. Now let me give you the third rule: stay in. This sounds almost childish in its simplicity. It is not childish, it is where fortunes are usually lost. The source material uses 2008 because 2008 remains one of the cleanest examples of mass emotional surrender. Markets collapsed. Accounts bled, fear sounded rational. Millions sold. Many of them never re-entered correctly. They did not merely lose during the crash. They missed the long recovery afterward. Fay file site Fay turn 44 file 0 Fay. That is what people still do not understand. A temporary fall in price is painful. Selling because you cannot emotionally hold the fall often turns temporary pain into permanent damage. This is why I say the market is not merely a test of information. It is a test of behavior under stress. The average person thinks the key question is what the market did. The richer question is what the investor did when the market did it. A crash is not the end of a process. It is the part of the process most likely to expose whether your system was emotional or structural. If your strategy requires calm conditions to function, it is not a strategy. It is a weather report. Serious money must survive bad weather. That is why staying invested matters so much. Not because volatility is fun, not because losing on paper feels noble, because the market does not reward people for being unafraid. It rewards people for continuing to hold or buy through periods that emotionally persuade the average person to do the opposite. That is why the third rule sounds simple and still defeats so many. Stay in, not blindly, not in garbage, not in some absurd speculative position you never understood. Stay in the broad compounding process, stay in good businesses, stay in the plan, stay in the habit. And if you cannot emotionally do that, then design a simpler plan until you can. Now I want to say something even more important. The pain of staying in is not proof the strategy is broken. It is part of the entry fee. That fee is called discomfort. The person who expects never to feel discomfort in compounding has not understood compounding. The person who can endure discomfort without rewriting the plan every time headlines become rude is the person most likely to eventually see what long-term markets do for disciplined capital. Now let me move to the fourth rule: know your own mind before your mind knows how to sabotage you. The source material talks directly about loss aversion, the neuroscience of pain around financial loss, and the fact that losing $100 hurts more than gaining $100 feels good. Fay Felicite, Fay turn 44 file 0 Fay, that matters because it explains why rational plans are so often abandoned by emotional humans. You are not a spreadsheet either. Every person making money decisions is carrying bias, fear, envy, impatience, and a private library of past financial embarrassment into the room. That is why self-knowledge matters so much. A person who knows that bad headlines trigger him can build defenses before the next downturn. A person who knows he becomes impulsive after a raise can commit the first portion of any new income before lifestyle gets a vote. A person who knows he chases stories can build a boring automatic plan that leaves less room for his imagination to ruin him. That is what the fourth rule really means. Do not build your financial life as if your emotions were an ally. Build it as if your emotions must be anticipated, respected, and sometimes strategically bypassed. That is not pessimism, that is maturity. A trusted spouse or friend who calms you down in bad markets matters. A written plan matters. An automatic investment schedule matters. Rules matter. Not because rules are spiritually beautiful, because you will not be spiritually beautiful every month. The structure must hold when the mood does not. That is the point. The most disciplined investors are not always the smartest. They are often the people who understood their own weaknesses early enough to design around them. That is wisdom. Now let me move to the fifth rule. do less. This is one of the hardest truths for modern people to accept, because activity feels like intelligence. The source material gives the story of an eager investor who researches constantly, trades often, and eventually discovers that simple index investing would have outperformed the complexity after costs, taxes, and wasted time. It also states plainly that most frequent traders underperform boring low-cost funds over the long run. Faithful site Fay turn 44 file 0 Fay. Exactly. This is one of the great humiliations in all of finance. The market often pays patience better than brilliance. A lot of people do not want that to be true. They want intelligence to feel busier. They want results to feel earned by visible action. The market often does not care. The market pays ownership, time, cost control. Low friction, broad exposure, minimal self-sabotage. That is what simple index investing is really about. It is not about laziness. It is about humility in front of a giant machine. The machine is complex. You do not need to be. That is a very expensive lesson if you learn it late. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying active investing never works. I am saying most people should assume they are less special than their excitement is telling them. That assumption will save them money. Complexity is not sophistication. It is often insecurity with charts attached. The person who keeps trading because action feels intelligent is usually paying for stimulation, not for superior outcomes. That is why the fifth rule is so powerful. Buy good companies or low-cost broad market funds, add regularly. Do not interfere with the process more than the process requires. That sounds embarrassingly plain. It is also one of the closest things this world offers to a reliable financial edge for ordinary people. Now let me move to the sixth rule. Destroy expensive debt before it destroys your future. The source material separates debt into useful debt and destructive debt, then gets very direct about credit cards. It notes typical credit card rates in the high teens or 20s and makes the blunt point that paying off such debt is mathematically superior to trying to outrun it with ordinary market returns. Fay file site Fay turn 44 file 0 Fay. That is exactly right. High interest debt is a financial emergency dressed up as normal life. You cannot tell me you are investing for the future while bleeding 20% a year in the present and expect me to take the story seriously. That arithmetic does not work. It never worked. The credit card became culturally normalized because it let people spend relief that does not make it benign. It makes it brilliant from the lender's point of view, because now the lender earns off impatience, emergencies, identity spending, and poor sequencing all at once. This is why paying off expensive debt is not a side quest. It is one of the highest return moves available to ordinary households. A guaranteed 20% avoided cost is superior to the uncertain long-term average return of most conventional investments. That is the sentence people do not want to hear because it is less fun than buying a stock. Fine. It is also much more useful. Now let me add one important distinction. A mortgage on a sensibly priced property can be productive debt. Debt used to acquire or build an asset can be productive debt. Consumer debt used to preserve a lifestyle your income cannot carry is corrosive debt. Those two things should not be discussed in the same tone. The first may build, the second erodes. If you are serious about building wealth, expensive consumer debt must be treated like a fire, not like a line item. You do not negotiate with a fire. You put it out. Now let me move to the seventh rule. Build the fortress first. The source material explains the emergency fund in the right way. It is not just about having cash for emergencies. It is about avoiding foreselling, avoiding desperate decisions, and protecting the investment plan from ordinary life. Fay file a site, Fay turn 44 file 0 Fay. That is why I love the metaphor of a fortress, because a lot of people want an empire without walls. That is foolish. If your car repair pushes you onto a credit card, you do not have an investment strategy. If a job loss forces you to liquidate a long-term position at the exact wrong moment, you do not have an investment strategy. You have hope. Hope is not liquid. The emergency fund is not sexy. It is insulation. It keeps life from grabbing the steering wheel every time something breaks. That matters more than people think because real life is not polite. Roofs leak, cars fail, jobs disappear, parents age, children need things, bodies get injured. If every such event must be financed by debt or by selling productive assets at the wrong time, then the structure is weak no matter how elegant the spreadsheet looked in calm weather. This is why I say build the fortress before the empire. 3 to 6 months of expenses in accessible cash is not overcautious. It is civilized. It is how adults stop living one surprise away from stupidity. Now, let me say something harder. Many people avoid building the emergency fund because cash looks unproductive. That is a beginner's mistake. Cash in an emergency fund is not there to maximize return. It is there to maximize decision quality under stress. That is one of the highest returns you can buy, not because the cash itself grows dramatically, because it prevents you from destroying the rest of the system when life becomes rude. That is the purpose. Purpose matters. Now, let me move to the 8th rule. Know what money is for. The source material is very clear here too. People who build durable wealth usually know what they want money to do, whether that means retirement, freedom, education for children, giving, or the power to leave work they hate. That clarity makes discipline feel like a choice instead of a punishment. Fayfelicite Fayturn 44 File 0 Fay, that is one of the deepest truths in all of finance. Money without intention does not feel powerful. It often feels anxious. A person who saves without purpose eventually starts resenting the savings. A person who invests without purpose eventually gets seduced by shiny detours because there is no bigger story anchoring him. Purpose is not soft. Purpose is one of the most practical tools in the entire system when you know what the money is for. Trade-offs become easier. No to the upgraded car because yes to the ability to leave bad work at 60. No to the impulsive purchase because yes to your child's education without debt. No to the panic sale because yes to the future you already described clearly enough that you do not want one violent week to steal it. That is how purpose behaves in money. It gives present restraint a future face. Without that face, discipline feels abstract. With that face, discipline becomes fidelity. And that difference matters. This is why I tell people to write the reason down. Not think it vaguely, write it, name the age, name the place, name the freedom, name the kind of life you want purchased by all this boring restraint, because if the goal remains blurry, the appetite of the present will always sound more persuasive than the quiet request of the future. That is not because you are weak. It is because the present has a microphone. The future usually whispers. Purpose turns the whisper into an instruction. Now let me move to the 9th rule. Do not wait for a perfect rescue of the past. The source material speaks directly to people in their 40s, 50s, and beyond who feel behind. Its message is correct. The perfect start time may be gone, but the principles themselves do not expire, and the most destructive decision is still inaction. Fayfelicite Fayturn 44 File 0 Fay I agree completely. Regret is one of the most financially expensive emotions in the world. A person looks at the compounding chart, realizes he should have begun earlier, and then uses the pain of that realization as a reason to delay again. That is madness. Time passed. Fine, what now? That is the only useful question, not because the lost years did not matter, they did, but the years ahead matter too, and they will pass whether you use them or not. The tree proverb survives because it is true. The best time was earlier. The second best time is now. Progress over perfection is not a consolation line. It is a working strategy for adults whose life did not follow an ideal spreadsheet. Maybe you are behind. Fine then, the work is still the work. Spend less than you earn. Kill the bad debt, build the reserve, automate the investing, know the purpose, stay in, think long. The timeline may change, the principles do not. This is one reason I reject the melodrama around being too late. Too late for what? Too late for an unrealistic fantasy of effortless compounding begun at 23. Maybe too late to become stronger than you are right now. Number too late to turn anxiety into structure. Number too late to give your future self more options than your present self had. Number, that is what matters. Not perfection, direction, always direction. Now let me move to the 10th rule, think in decades. This is the rule underneath all the others. The source material ends here for a reason. It says the real builders of wealth think in much longer frames than the culture encourages. They buy not for next quarter alone, but for 10 or 15 years. They live for the future self, not only the agitated present one. Fayfelicite Fayturn 44 File 0 Fay, that is exactly right. The world is built to accelerate your impatience. Your phone lets you watch prices tick every minute. News turns ordinary volatility into moral drama. Ads sell urgency, culture sells speed. Everything around you says now. Now, and wealth says something much less exciting. Later. That is why so few people build it. Later is emotionally thin in the short run. You do not get applause for later. You often get inconvenience. You get the feeling of missing out. You get the private embarrassment of watching other people consume more visibly while you quietly allocate toward invisible claims on your future. That is not easy. Still, it is the path. The long game mindset is not a personality quirk. It is one of the greatest financial advantages available to an ordinary person in a culture that worships immediacy. A person who can think in decades does not need to win every quarter. He only needs to avoid self-destruction and keep feeding good systems. That is enough over long enough time. Enough is extraordinary. Now let me say something even harder. Thinking in decades is not passive. It is active restraint. It is the refusal to let urgency colonize decisions that belong to the future. It is the refusal to let one ugly week rewrite a 10-year thesis. It is the refusal to let one bonus, one impulse, one market story, one social comparison, or one moment of fatigue tear a hole in the structure. That is what long-term thinking really is. Not dreamy patience, guarded patience, aggressive patience, a commitment to preserving the conditions under which compounding remains possible. That is why the 10th rule belongs beneath all the others. Without long-term time preference, none of the other rules survive. Now, I want to step back and gather the whole machine. Spend less than you earn. Start now. Stay in. Know your emotional weaknesses. Prefer simple compounding over dramatic complexity. Destroy high-interest debt. Build the fortress. Clarify your why. Refuse paralysis about being behind. Think in decades. That is not a product. That is not a secret. That is a character system. And character in this context does not mean niceness. It means repeatability. Can you repeat the right thing long enough? That is the real test. Not can you feel inspired for a week. Can you repeat? That is why boring people with boring systems so often become much richer than exciting people with exciting intentions. The exciting person keeps restarting. The boring person keeps adding. The exciting person keeps searching for a breakthrough. The boring person keeps widening the gap, protecting the fortress, and buying more of the future. The market eventually respects the second person much more. Now let me make the identity flip explicit. Most people think wealth starts when the money gets big enough. That is too late. Wealth starts when behavior becomes consistent enough that the numbers can finally begin trusting you with more. That is the flip. A person with a large income and chaotic behavior is still fragile. A person with a modest income and strong behavior is already becoming wealthy, in the only way that matters. Structurally, the account balance catches up later. That is why I do not obsess first about the total. I obsess about the machine. Does the machine preserve a gap? Does it feed investments? Does it survive downturns? Does it avoid bad debt? Does it have purpose? Does it keep going when life gets noisy? That is the machine. If the machine is sound, the money usually comes. If the machine is unsound, a windfall often only delays the obvious. Now, let me put the blade into this as cleanly as I can. Turning $100 into millions is not a trick. It is not a story about brilliance. It is the long result of small, disciplined, unglamorous decisions repeated with enough consistency that time finally begins to amplify them. That is the truth. And if you remember nothing else from what I said, remember this. The biggest difference between people who retire comfortable and people who retire dependent is rarely a single dramatic decision. It is the accumulated effect of small behaviors carried across years by someone who was willing to be boring, precise, patient, and stubborn in a culture that rewarded the opposite. That person can be you, not after one lucky break. Now,